The wind sweeps across a field of withered grass, carrying with it the sound of something long forgotten, an echo, a whisper, a trace of a life most would prefer buried. In a small town that no longer exists on any modern map, a story unfolded that shattered every boundary of morality, family, and human instinct. It begins not in the open, but in the shadows of an old farmhouse where shame and secrecy built walls thicker than stone. This is not just the tale of a broken family. It is the haunting account of a woman who became both mother and sister in the same breath, a life twisted by silence, control, and bloodlines that were never meant to cross. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The events you're about to hear are not folklore. They are not whispers from ghost stories told around campfires. They are a matter of record, though the records themselves were buried, hidden behind courthouse walls, left to rot in archives no one visits anymore. It began with a girl, barely a woman, trapped in the confinement of her own home. In her world, there were no outsiders. Her life revolved around her family, and her family alone. What the town suspected was strange, but what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was far more disturbing. Neighbors remember glimpses of her face pressed against cracked window glass, eyes hollow yet alert, as if she was watching but forbidden to be seen. Years later, when the truth finally broke open, they would recall those same eyes, haunted, pleading, as though she had already seen her future long before it arrived. When the child was finally born, it wasn't celebrated. It wasn't even whispered about with joy. Instead, it was hidden, kept secret as if the very walls of that house were conspiring to keep the truth from escaping, because this was no ordinary child. This baby was her son, and at the same time her brother. A truth so unbearable it nearly erased itself from history, nearly. To understand how such a thing could happen, you have to step back into the world she was born into. Rural America in the early 20th century was a place of isolation, long dirt roads that stretched endlessly, neighbors miles apart, and families who rarely mixed with outsiders. In those forgotten corners, bloodlines often stayed too close for comfort, and what began as survival turned into something far darker. The girl's family lived on the edge of town, where the church bells could barely be heard, and where gossip reached too late to stop anything. Her father was a man both feared and respected, a figure whose authority was absolute within the walls of his home. To the community, he was a hard worker, a strict patriarch, but behind closed doors, he ruled with something closer to tyranny. For the young girl, childhood never really existed. Her world was not one of dolls and schoolbooks, but of silence and obedience. Every movement was monitored, every word weighed. She was taught early on that her duty was not to herself, but to the family, to obey, to preserve, to endure. The first whispers of something unnatural surfaced when she stopped appearing at school. Teachers asked questions, but the family always had an excuse: illness, chores, bad weather. Eventually, the questions stopped, and that silence was exactly what the family needed. Isolation breeds secrets. The farther a family is from the eyes of others, the more easily those secrets can take root and grow unchecked. The girl became a prisoner in her own home, living under a father who blurred the lines between protector and violator. The town might have suspected something wasn't right, but no one dared to interfere. When the girl's body began to change, no one outside the home was allowed to notice. Loose clothing disguised the truth, and trips into town grew rarer until they stopped altogether for 9 months. The world outside that farmhouse continued unaware, while inside, a nightmare took shape. And then the day came. A single cry from a newborn echoed through the hallways, a sound that should have meant joy but instead carried the weight of ruin. The truth was no longer just suspicion, it had taken form, flesh and breath. The baby was born, and with him, the line between family and betrayal was crossed forever. The baby's arrival was not met with neighbors bearing gifts or church bells ringing in celebration. There were no birth records filed in town, no announcements made, no proud father shaking hands at the general store. Instead, the child entered a world already steeped in denial. His existence itself was a living confession, and so he was hidden. Witnesses later said the family kept the curtains drawn at all hours, even in the middle of summer. Visitors were turned away, and those who insisted on stopping by never caught sight of the infant. He was kept inside, sometimes in a crib, sometimes carried close to the mother's chest, as though her embrace could shield him from both the outside world and the shame of his origin. But shame has a way of showing itself, even when you try to bury it. The boy's features carried subtle but undeniable signs of his parentage. His jawline grew uneven, his eyes slightly crossed, and there was something in his mannerisms that felt off. Those who eventually saw him whispered the same words. "That child doesn't look right." As he grew, so did the whispers. Children in town who happened to catch a glimpse would ask questions their parents couldn't answer. Some avoided the farmhouse altogether, claiming the boy's stare left them unsettled, as if he knew a truth they weren't supposed to know. The young mother, who was also his sister, bore the weight silently. She never spoke of what had happened to her, not to the neighbors, not to the church, not even to the boy himself. She carried the dual burden of being both victim and caregiver, forced to nurture the very life that symbolized her own violation. For the father, silence was protection. He believed that as long as the family stayed quiet, the secret would rot away behind the closed doors of their home. But secrets like this never die quietly. They fester, they grow, and sooner or later, someone notices. It was only a matter of time before the truth seeped beyond those farmhouse walls. A curious neighbor, a doctor's visit, a slip of the tongue. The fragile world the father had built to contain his shame began to crack, and once the cracks appear, the whole house eventually falls. The collapse began slowly, almost invisibly, like rot spreading beneath the floorboards of an old house. At first it was whispers, half-believed rumors carried from one neighbor's porch to another. People wondered why the girl had vanished from school so suddenly, why the family avoided gatherings, why the curtains never opened. And then there was the boy himself. Each year, as he grew older, the harder it became to hide him. The first outsider to notice something was wrong was a midwife, called discreetly to the farmhouse when the boy was still an infant and ill with fever. She expected a routine call, but what she witnessed left her shaken. The girl, far too young to be a mother, clutched the child with desperation, her eyes swollen from crying. The man of the house, the supposed father, hovered close, controlling the conversation, answering questions before she could speak. The midwife left unsettled, her instincts gnawing at her, but in that era, few dared to challenge the authority of a patriarch. Still, the seed of suspicion had been planted, and in small towns, suspicion spreads faster than wildfire. By the time the boy was 5, stories began to form that he was the son of sin, that his birth was the result of something unspeakable. Some even claimed the land itself seemed cursed, that the air around the farmhouse felt heavier, darker, as if the soil absorbed the family's shame. The mother's life, meanwhile, became a cycle of suffocating silence. She was still a teenager when she was forced into the role of caretaker, her identity erased, her voice muted. To the outside world, she barely existed. To the boy, she was both everything and nothing, a sister who mothered him, a mother who could never truly explain who she was. And then came the breaking point. A visitor to town, a distant cousin who had not seen the family in years, stayed long enough to recognize something that the locals had tried to ignore. The resemblance between the boy and his grandfather was unmistakable. It wasn't just in the eyes or the jawline, it was in the way he walked, the way he tilted his head, the smallest gestures that betrayed the truth. From that moment on, denial was no longer possible. The family's secret had been exposed, not by confession, but by the undeniable mark of bloodlines colliding where they never should have. The town could no longer pretend it didn't see what was happening. And with that realization came a wave of fear, disgust, and condemnation that would forever change the fate of everyone inside that farmhouse. The revelation spread like a sickness. What had once been murmurs on porches became full conversations spoken in lowered voices at the church steps, in the aisles of the general store, at the far end of the bar where men nursed their whiskey late into the night. Everyone had an opinion, but no one dared confront the father directly. In a town where reputation was currency, scandal was both entertainment and poison. The girl, now a young woman, became the focus of pity and condemnation all at once. Some saw her as a victim, a child robbed of her innocence, while others whispered that she must have invited it, that she had sinned alongside the man who ruled her life. Few acknowledged the truth, that she had never been given a choice. The boy, too, began to feel the weight of the town's judgment. Children mocked him behind his back, their parents pulling them away when he came too close. The church, once a place of sanctuary, offered no refuge. The preacher spoke of sins of the flesh and unnatural unions, words that cut through the congregation like knives. Everyone knew exactly who he meant, but no one said the family's name aloud. Inside the farmhouse, the air grew tense, suffocating. The father became more controlling than ever, lashing out at both daughter and grandson alike. He believed that secrecy had failed because others had spoken, not because of his own actions. His solution was not confession nor repentance, but deeper isolation. Doors were locked tighter, windows sealed, voices hushed. But the harder he tried to contain the truth, the more violently it fought to escape. The mother, trapped in this cage of blood and silence, aged far too quickly. Her youth drained away under the burden of raising a child who was also her brother, while living under the shadow of the man who had forced it all upon her. In her eyes lingered a quiet desperation, the look of someone who wanted to escape, but no longer believed escape was possible. Yet history shows that no secret of this magnitude can remain hidden forever. Shame may bury itself for a season, but eventually it claws its way to the surface, and when it does, it consumes not just a family, but an entire community. The stage was set for confrontation, for exposure so complete that not even the father's iron grip could stop it. The question was not if the truth would come out, it was when and at what cost. The moment of reckoning came in fragments, not a single explosion but a series of cracks in the facade that could no longer be repaired. It began with whispers turning into statements, with neighbors no longer averting their eyes when the family walked into town. Some dared to confront the father, quietly at first, but he dismissed them with threats and cold stares. But the truth had gained momentum, and momentum cannot be silenced. A county official, tipped off by the midwife's old suspicions, came to investigate. There were no courtrooms, no headlines in the local paper. Not yet. But the visit alone was enough to stir panic. The family was questioned, and though the father answered with his usual authority, the daughter's silence spoke louder than anything he could say. The boy, by then nearing adolescence, could no longer escape the stares. He was not just an odd child. He was a living symbol of the family's sin. His features, his very existence, condemned them in a way words never could. Even he began to sense it, asking questions his mother could not bring herself to answer. Why don't I look like the other boys? Why do they call me different? Those questions were daggers in her heart, each one reminding her of a truth she wished she could erase. And then, the church turned its back. One Sunday morning, the preacher declared that some sins were too great to be forgiven unless confessed openly and repented for publicly. It was not naming names, but everyone knew. That week, the family's pew sat empty. It would remain empty forever. The farmhouse became a prison of shame, its walls echoing with silence, broken only by arguments that grew louder with each passing night. The mother's spirit, once dimmed, now teetered between collapse and rebellion. For the boy, confusion hardened into bitterness, a childhood stripped from him before it ever began. It was around Tao, His time that the family began to fracture, the daughter withdrawing further into herself, the father tightening his control, and the boy caught between them, both victim and reminder of the darkness that bound them together. And here's where I'll ask you something. If you're still watching this story, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken out or stayed silent, hoping no one ever uncovered the truth? Because for this family, silence was no longer an option. The breaking point arrived like a storm no one could stop. Whispers became accusations, accusations became outrage, and outrage demanded answers. The courthouse records show little detail, but enough to confirm what the town had long suspected. The child was not merely a grandson, but the product of a father's unspeakable violation of his own daughter. When the truth could no longer be contained, the family's world disintegrated. The father was taken away in disgrace, his reputation forever blackened, his legacy nothing but a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Yet even in his downfall, he showed no remorse. To the end, he denied wrongdoing, insisting he had only done what was necessary to keep the family together. Those words would haunt the daughter for the rest of her life. The young mother, who had never been given a choice, was left to pick up the pieces. But her life had already been consumed by shame. Though still young, her spirit carried the weight of decades. She could not escape the stares, nor the knowledge that her child would forever be marked by the circumstances of his birth. Some say she tried to leave town, others that she lived out her years in quiet isolation, never speaking of what had happened. What is certain is that she was both victim and survivor, bound forever to a past she could never outrun. As for the boy, her son, her brother, his fate is more difficult to trace. Records grow thin, names disappear, and stories conflict. Some believe he lived into adulthood, carrying the scars of a childhood built on secrecy and shame. Others claim he vanished, taken in by distant relatives who erased his identity to protect him from the truth. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps he lived, but only as a ghost of himself, hiding in plain sight. What remains is not clarity, but silence. The farmhouse rotted away, the land eventually sold, the family names scrubbed from memory. But the story lingers, like a shadow that refuses to fade. Because stories like this do not belong to one family alone, they reveal something darker about the human condition itself. How silence can protect evil, how power can twist love into control, and how secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way back to the surface. You stumbled across this story tonight, but perhaps it was never meant to stay hidden. Perhaps it was waiting, all along, for someone brave enough to listen. And so we end where we began, with a farmhouse on the edge of nowhere, its windows shuttered, its rooms silent, but its walls still whispering the truth of what happened inside. A truth that will not die, because now you know it.